I love working with plaid and striped fabric, but they aren't always the easiest fabrics to incorporate into blocks. Because of that strong directionality, they really need a pattern that takes advantage of it. So I saw that Allison Glass was releasing a new line, and it is all plaids and stripes, and these colors are amazing. This is like the bright fuchsia plaid, but the line ranges all the way through purples and aquas and into this amazing kind of gold bright orange. So I designed a pattern to try to take advantage of that directionality in the print. And I didn't want to cut these pieces down too small and lose that print. So these are also nice big pieces. So if you're looking for a fairly fast quilt, this might be perfect for you. I have gone ahead and pressed all of my fabrics before I began. This fabric does have a little bit more of an open weave than a traditional quilting cotton or like Kona cotton solid. So I did take care to not stretch the fabric out of shape. If you would like to use a little bit of starch while pressing, that might be a fantastic idea. We will be cutting these fat quarters into biased edge shapes. So adding that little bit of structure with the starch might be really helpful. So we're going to cut these fat quarters together for kind of the main portion of our blocks, but I have already gone ahead and cut all of the background fabric for this quilt. Now, if you are using a solid or a reversible fabric, then the cutting is a little bit easier. If you are using a print, then you need to make sure you maintain the fold of the fabric as it comes off the bolt, so that when you cut your triangles, you end up with mirrored image pairs. And you will need those for the mirrored image blocks. The cutting diagram for this quilt is fairly simple. You're just going to be cutting two long rectangles from your fat quarters. The important part comes in when if you are using a stripe or a plaid and you want to maintain that kind of mirror image look like I have in my quilt, then when you stack those two long rectangles on top of each other to cut them into our diamond shapes, you want to stack them right sides together as though you're kind of closing a book and the kind of cut line between them is the spine, and that will help you maintain that look. If you are not using a stripe or a plaid, then you can stack them however you would like to stack them because you're not trying to maintain that look. The cutting diagram also includes some scrappy fabric strips for your binding. I cut mine at 2 1/4 inches, but you have enough room to cut 2.5 inch strips. So you can see me here folding these two together as though they are a book. And I have the 60-degree diamond Creative Grids ruler, but if you do not have this ruler, then there is also a template in the pattern that you can use. And you can see me just aligning the edge to kind of get that initial angle, and then swapping the whole thing around so that I can cut the full diamond shapes. I'm using the 6.5 inch lines on my ruler, but again, there's a template in the pattern. You do not need this ruler. It will just speed up your cutting and make it a little bit easier. There's also a template for the background triangles that you will also need. Once you have your diamond shapes cut, then you can open them up and you'll see this kind of V or mirrored shape appear. So I have finished cutting our fat quarter, and I also have my background fabric here. Now I am using Kona Flame for the background of this quilt. I have been trying really hard lately to get away from using like white or gray for the background of every single quilt, and this flame color matched some of the colors in the prints perfectly, and I thought it was a great fall color and really outside of my usual box, so I went for it. And hopefully it all comes together in the end. But I have all of my triangles here, and this is the layout for the block. You can see we have our mirrored pairs of our diamonds here. So I am just going to fill in the kind of sides of our diamonds that we need to sew. Now I do it this way, laying the whole block out, because it is easy to sew these triangles to the wrong side of our diamond. And we want to make sure that we sew them to the correct sides so that we maintain this nice mirror image look to our blocks. If I was to accidentally sew the pieces on this block here and here, then it would be really difficult to get the block kind of back in order. So I like to just lay it out, and then I know for sure where all of the pieces go. Now that we have it all laid out, it is time to sew our pieces together. So let's just take one of these diamonds and look at how we attach the triangles. So now that I have just one diamond in front of me, along with its kind of two triangle friends, we need to talk about joining these together. And the trickiest part of sewing angled pieces together is making sure that the kind of long side pieces stay in line with each other. So I've sewn a line on the wrong side of this triangle just to illustrate where these points need to come together. We're not sewing along the edge of our fabric, so we don't want to align the edge of our fabric. We want to align the two lines that are 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. So when we look at this line, we want it to point right at the little V where these two shapes come together. And so now when we stitch on that line and fold it back open, the side of our block unit will be nice and straight and ready to attach to the block next to it. If we were to offset them and stitch them so that this side wasn't even, then you're going to have this weird gap here. Now, if it's small, if it's 1/8 of an inch, you can just include that in the seam allowance when you sew the blocks together. But if it's significant, if you're 1/4 of an inch off, then there just isn't enough fabric to kind of sew together. And that means that your blocks aren't going to match up, your points aren't going to match, and you're just going to have a really hard time assembling your quilt top. So you just want to take a moment when you sew these triangles to the diamonds to make sure that the tips of the orange triangles, or the background triangles, mine are orange, yours might be another color, are hanging off the edge of these diamonds just a little bit, about 1/4 of an inch. And that will allow you to have a nice straight block unit when you press them open. So let's go ahead and sew this line. So I'm using my seam guide here, as I do with almost all of my piecing, and it just kind of makes it a little bit easier for me to have a nice straight seam allowance and a consistent seam allowance. And you can see as we're approaching the V where these two pieces come together, our stitch line is going to intersect with that V perfectly. And now you can see when we open this up, we have a nice perfect corner here and a nice straight edge of our block here. Now, these are just little dog ears. They'll be trimmed off, but that's our block. And now we can go ahead and do the same thing with this side. And I'm just aligning the edges and then shifting it so that this V is 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. And here is our little block unit. Now I'm going to make the other 4 of these and press them. There is quite a bit of bulk at the very center of this block, and so I am going to take a few seconds and trim off these little dog ears and press my seam allowances open. I usually do that, but in this case, it will really help in that very center of the block where there are a lot of seams and pieces of fabric coming together. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the other 3 kind of units to our block, and then we'll meet right back. I have made the 4 units to our block here. I've attached our orange triangles to each side of our diamond, and I did go ahead and just take some scissors and lop off the little dog ears that were kind of poking out from the corners and the sides. So now we are ready to assemble our block. We are just going to sew it together like we would any 4-patch. I'm going to place these 2 pieces right sides together and sew that seam, and then I will sew this seam, and then I will attach that long seam that goes all the way across. I will be pressing those seam allowances open as I construct the block because this center portion right here does have a lot of pieces that come together. So the flatter you can make each seam, the flatter all of the seams once they're together will be. So let's sew this together. Before we sew the long seam of this block together, I want to take just a minute to talk about angles and seam allowances and why these points are never going to come together in the center of this block. So let me put a diagram up here for just a sec. When you are sewing a half square triangle into a quilt, you are working with a 45-degree seam line, and that's just half of a 90-degree kind of right angle, the corner of the block. That 45-degree seam line cuts it exactly in half. And that means that when you take 1/4 of an inch from one side and 1/4 of an inch from the other side, that seam line still goes into the corner of the block once it's pieced into the quilt. Now, the block we're working on here isn't 45-degree angles. We had a 60-degree diamond and a 30-degree triangle. And those together make up that same 90 degrees, but they aren't equal. So that means that when you take 1/4 of an inch from one side and 1/4 of an inch from the other, that seam line no longer goes into the corner of that block once it's pieced into the quilt. It's just how these kind of pieces work. There are 2 things that you can do with this information. You can ignore it, and you can just let your points not match. And that's what I've chosen to do in this quilt. I don't think it's terribly important that these 2 sections of background meet in the middle. And having them not meet actually gives a little bit more room for all that fabric that comes together in the center. It gives it a little bit more room for it to breathe. And so it's just a little bit easier piecing, and you won't have as much bulk in the center of this block as you would if you were sewing together 4 half square triangles. The other thing that you can do is fudge your block or your seam allowance so that these do come together in the middle. You could take these units and trim them down so that this point is 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So you would trim off about 1/4 of an inch of the side of this block so that when you sewed them together, these points would come together. Or you can fudge your seam allowance and sew this seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see with our ruler, this point is 1/2 an inch away from the edge. So when you take 1/2 an inch from here and 1/2 an inch from here, these points will come together. If you do that, it will slightly change the size of your blocks. Not by a lot, by about 1/2 an inch, but it's worth considering if you are working with a block that you're trying to fit into other blocks. For my purposes, this is a fun, quick quilt. I am not worried about my points exactly matching. So I'm just going to sew it together with 1/4 of an inch, and these 2 points will end up just a little bit apart. And that's okay with me. And here we have our completed block. You can see these points do not come together and match. They're not that far off, and from a distance, the quilt's gonna look great. So I've just decided not to worry about these little things. But again, it's your quilt. If you want to make these match, then now you know how. I'm going to go ahead and finish the last couple of blocks I have for this quilt, and then I'm going to go ahead and assemble the whole quilt top. It's a simple layout of 3 columns by 5 rows, and it's easy piecing once you get the blocks together. So there is a diagram in the pattern if you need a little bit of help with the layout. And when I come back, I will have the quilt top finished, and it'll be time to talk about quilting options. So my quilt top is complete and now it is time to quilt it. I am quilting it on my long arm, but stay tuned because there is some quilting to see on my domestic machine. I made an additional block and turned it into a pillow front so I could show you how to achieve the same look that I am quilting here on a domestic machine. Now, to quilt this design, I used just one ruler and I marked kind of across the equator of each diamond, an inch in from both sides and then 2 inches in from both sides. And then once I had completed those kind of echoes in from the tips of the diamonds, I had one more pass kind of up the middle of the diamond, and that 5th line in each diamond is what allowed me to travel from diamond to diamond really easily. If I had just done the 2 echoes, then I would have ended up where I started. So giving me that extra line made this quilting really easy to accomplish. I did not stitch in the ditch on this quilt. The intersections of these blocks were quite bulky because there is so much fabric coming in to meet at those centers of the blocks. I decided that stitching in the ditch would be a lot more trouble than it was worth, and I would probably end up wavering off that line quite a bit, especially considering I was using bright orange thread and it would really show. Once I finished the diamonds quilting across the quilt, it was time to tackle the background areas of this quilt. Now, these were a little bit plain. I kind of considered doing just the same path across these diamonds that I had done in the print diamonds. But since it is a solid background, I thought it could use a little bit of interest, especially since I was using a matching thread, and I knew that doing a little bit of free motion quilting would add a lot of texture, but it wouldn't be too crazy. So I followed almost the same path without that line in the middle. So you can see me kind of heading back to exactly where I started quilting this diamond. And once I get to the beginning, instead of doing the straight line across the middle like I did in the print, I switch to the kind of manual mode on my machine and do some tight back and forth lines to really give a little bit of interest and squish down the batting in that background area. I thought that it would add interest and also help the print diamonds really pop. I repeated these 2 kind of alternating rows all the way down the quilt, and once I finished, then I decided to attach my binding while it was on the long arm. Now that my quilt is done, it is time to show you guys how to get the same look on a domestic machine. Now, I made an extra block for this project. It's not included in the instructions for your quilt, but if you would like to make an extra block and make a matching pillow, then you'll just need one more fat quarter and a little bit of background fabric. I did add a little bit to the sides just to bring that single block up to about 19 inches square to make a pillow front. I used my walking foot to make the straight lines for the diamond block patterns, and you can see me just using a piece of paper to line up the markings that I made on the blocks. It just kind of gives you a little bit a more sure way than eyeballing it to line up those dots. You can certainly eyeball it, but I had that piece of paper right there that was kind of my cheat sheet for marking the diamonds. Instead of doing one diamond at a time, like I did on my long arm, it was easiest to go kind of all the way across the work from diamond to diamond, just doing one line at a time. If you had a large quilt here that you were rotating, then you wouldn't want to rotate it 180 degrees every time. So instead you can do kind of one row of diamonds at a time. Once I finished all the passes on the diamonds, it was time to do the background design. I used the same kind of walking foot setup to get the straight lines in the backgrounds of the diamonds. And the only little adjustment I had to make here was to kind of pivot at the center of the block here. You can see I had to kind of pivot just to go straight for a couple of stitches to move over to that next orange diamond. And I used the same marking as I did on the long arm. I even used my same little cheat sheet. So I would just go from diamond to diamond all the way across your quilt, and then we'll get ready for the free motion quilting. To do the free motion quilting, the little back and forth lines that go in the center of the diamonds on the background color, I switched the orientation of my work so that I was stitching kind of towards and away from myself. It's a little bit more natural position rather than going side to side, and I find it's a lot easier to maintain straight lines. As expected, the quilting on a domestic machine is a little bit slower than it is on a long arm, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. It's a smaller needle, it's a little bit more difficult to move the work that you're working on rather than the long arm, but you're gonna get the same look. I'm using the side of my hopping foot here as kind of a general guide to space my back and forth lines. They ended up being about 1/4 of an inch apart. That was a little bit bigger spacing than they were on the long arm, but the look is very, very similar. And I certainly could have spaced them more densely here, but I just kind of found a rhythm and it looked good, so I kept going. To set up my machine for free motion quilting, I did not bother putting on my Supreme slider on this machine. The kind of base of this machine is quite slick, and I was also working with a pretty small piece of fabric. I started out without my gloves on, but pretty quickly realized that I had a much better grip and a better kind of sewing experience using my gloves. If you've never tried gloves, then they're a relatively small investment to make, and they really do make quite a big difference. I even use mine when I am attaching a binding to my quilts on my domestic machine. They just really help you grip that fabric and move it through your machine with a much less strain on your hands and your shoulders. My machine here is set up for free motion quilting with a quilting needle from Schmetz, and it's a size 75. This is my favorite needle to use when free motion quilting. It's a little bit stronger, a little bit more flexible, and I get a lot fewer breaks when I'm using a specialty quilting needle. As for thread, I'm using Aurifil here. On my long arm, I use a polyester So Fine 50 weight, but I keep cotton by my upstairs machine, my piecing machine, and so that's what I used. My quilt is complete. Now, it finished at about 58 inches square, which is kind of a small throw. If you wanted to expand this quilt and make it a little bit bigger, then you could add fat quarters and just add blocks. It's 1 fat quarter plus the background for each block. So you could really make this about any size you wanted. The blocks are about 11.5 by 19.5, so you could make any arrangement you wanted. I used Quilter's Dream Orient batting in this quilt, and it is a really lovely low loft, thin batting that is a bamboo and I believe silk blend along with some cotton, I believe. And it is a really lovely, very drapey batting. And that means that you can add all of the really dense quilting that I used in these background triangles, and it doesn't make it really stiff like if you did very dense quilting on a cotton or a wool. It really does maintain a lot of the drape. Bamboo also has some antibacterial properties, so it'd be great for like a kid's quilt that you need to wash. You know what I'm saying? Or it's thin enough to be like a great summer weight quilt. I think I'm gonna do like maybe a bedspread for my bed in this batting for next summer. I finished my quilt with this scrappy binding, which the cutting instructions include strips for this binding. If you do want to go the scrappy binding route, you have plenty of fabric in the fat quarters to do that. I also finished my pillow from the domestic quilting, and this turned out great. Now, because the block was kind of not a square, I did have to add a little bit of side background pieces just to kind of make the kind of oddly rectangular block big enough to make a pillow front out of. Now, you guys saw me do the quilting that kind of mirrored the quilt, and then to fill in these background areas, I just did some echo lines just to fill in the area. And on the back, I used a scrap of the backing from the quilt to do the back of the pillow, and I just did straight lines just to get it quilted. And a little nice contrasty blue zipper, as I love to do. The pattern for this quilt is a free download. You can find the link in the description right below this video, or you can just go to my website, tinyorchardquilts.com, and find it under the free patterns area. Now I'll be back in 2 weeks with another full quilt tutorial, but in the meantime there is a link to all of my fat quarter patterns just like this one that are full quilt tutorials, and the other video is a video that YouTube thinks that you will love. So I will be back soon, but in the meantime, happy quilting. It's a silk bamboo blend. Did I just say bamboo blend?